All right, as the investigation into Charlie Kirk's assassination continues, the House Oversight Committee now probing online platforms that could have played a role. The CEOs of Reddit, Discord, Twitch, and Steam are all expected to appear before the committee soon. But earlier today, it was former White House Chief of Staff Jeff Zient's turn to face the Oversight Committee. He had a lot to say about former President Joe Biden's mental decline in office, among other things. He admitted that as Biden's term, went on, his decision-making got slower. Sometimes it took Biden up to 4 in-person meetings to finalize a decision. Here now with the details is the chairman of the House Oversight Committee. James Comer is with us. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Tell us about these groups that you're going to be investigating.
Well, first of all, the CEOs of those 4 companies, there's a pattern that's developed among many of the crimes, the most high-profile crimes that have been committed by particularly juveniles over the last several months. The pattern is that the criminals have been using these platforms to communicate with others, and we want to bring the CEOs in to see if they're to see how they market those platforms and what foreign actors are coming in and maybe trying to influence young people to spread hate and to spread violence on those platforms. We want to give the CEOs an opportunity to tell us why they think these platforms are the new form of communication, and if there are things that we can do in Congress to prevent this or to identify this, or if law enforcement can do a better job of identifying potential crimes before they happen. And we don't want to do anything to limit speech, but at the same time, we have to recognize that there is a pattern here, and we need to try to find any solution to prevent these types of mass shootings, these types of high-profile crimes from juveniles from happening again.
The Biden's ex-chief of staff, everything that I read that happened today sounds like the most explosive so far of all the people that you've interviewed. What did you learn today?
Well, he went very far in admitting that Joe Biden was in decline. He admitted that the debate was a disaster. He said that he thought the president should have had a cognitive test after the debate. But we had other staffers that came in during the depositions and said that no one talked about that. So there's so many conflicting stories. We brought all the Biden inner circle in to talk about the auto pen, to talk about the Joe Biden's obvious mental decline, and we got a lot of different answers. But this was his chief of staff. Zients was his chief of staff. We believe he was the main user of the auto pen. He also said that Hunter Biden was there present in discussing a lot of the pardons. And look, Joe Biden said in his one interview post-presidency that he didn't okay all the pardons, that he delegated that to his staff. That's not how the pardon process works, Sean. And to learn now that Hunter Biden was in there, a guy who we've already proven was taking money from our adversaries around the world. And you look at who some of these people were who got pardons that were pardoned by the auto pen. These are big money Democrat donors. We had one in Kentucky. There are a lot of questions that need to be asked. But one thing that I can say with confidence is that it was very obvious that Joe Biden was in mental decline. And it's very obvious that his staff was behind the excessive use of the auto pen, and I think that puts the pardons and executive orders in deep legal jeopardy.
What is next? Will you bring in the Biden family?
We're going to talk about it as a committee. We believe we have a lot of information now. Do we want to go several months in trying to bring in more people to talk about this? We've got emails. We've got hours and hours of depositions from the Biden inner circle. I think we've got enough information to issue a report and recommendations to President Trump. I think that, what we suggest will probably end up in court. And I think that we've got a lot of evidence that every American would find very concerning as to the excessive use of the auto pen, a president that was clearly checked out, a staff that was very disrespectful of the president, just like Kamala Harris said in her book excerpts when she said, we never should have let Joe make the decision to run again. That's symbolic of how the Biden inner circle was treating the president of the United States. They just stuck him in a corner and let him look out the window, it appears, while they were using that auto pen.
Congressman Comer, appreciate your time as always. Thank you.